Today we're going to learn Shabbat Daf Gimel. Today's shiur is sponsored by Gita Jaroslawich Neufeld in memory of her father Yosef and Menachem Mendel Bepesha Zichrono Lebracha, and by Harriet Hartman in memory of her husband Moshe ben Yehuda Aryeh Zichrono Lebracha on his first year at site. Okay, today we're going to start with the top of at the Mishna on Gimel. We're continuing with tying knots. Okay, I just want to review. We had this issue of tying knots. We started on Daf Aleph Amud Bet. Rashi there had said it's any kesher shel kayama that you leave there forever. And that was Rashi's definition. I just want to add that the Rambam and others, Rabbeinu Hananel and the Rif, basically say that it's not only that it's going to last forever, but it has to be maaseh uman. It has to be a specialist did it. And not that a specialist does. And that's why specifically they talked about the gamalim, the camels, and the sapanim, because the boats, those are done by specialists. They're specialty type knots and not just regular knots. And with that, we're going to continue and eventually today move on. The next Mishna already is going to be on a different topic. And we're going to finish with Haggadah today on Megillat Ruth. Koshrim deli bepiskaya, avalo bechevel. You can tie a knot with a piskaya. Okay, what's a piskaya? Rashi says, deli bepiskaya al pi habo, the piskaya lo mevatale hatam. The issue with the piskaya is that it's a wide kind of belt. And the issue is Rashi says, he doesn't leave it there, okay? It's not something permanent. Avalo bechevel. So if you tie it with this belt, the piskaya, it's not going to be permanent. If you tie it with a rope, it's going to be permanent or more permanent. Rabbi Yehuda matir. However, Rabbi Yehuda says even with a rope, it's going to be okay. We'll have to see what their machloket is. Klal amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda made the following klal generalization: kol kesher she'eno shel kayama ein chayavin alav. If it's a kesher that's not going to be long lasting, then you're not obligated. Okay. Now there's a bit of a question because it sounds like kol kesher she'eno shel kayama ein chayavin alav, and as it sounds like it's relating to the previous case. And it sounds like ein chayavin alav, which means you're not chayav, but it's forbidden. That's what we always say. You're not obligated by Torah law, but it is prohibited by rabbinic law. And yet, the Mishna said, the line before that was that Rabbi Yehuda allows this case. So if this sentence refers to the previous case, it doesn't make so much sense. So either you have to say, ein chayavin alav means you're not obligated and it's actually permitted. And this goes back to something we said before, that the Mishnah doesn't always use the exact same language to mean the exact same thing. And sometimes they said something that in one context might mean patur aval asur, but here it doesn't necessarily mean that. That's one explanation. Some people say this is actually talking about the case in the previous Mishnah about Rabbi Meir, and it's relating to a different issue entirely. And some people say that the first sentence is referring to a different type of chevel that people use, rope that people use, where that's actually allowed. And the second, which we'll see in the Gemara, what they say it's referring to. And the second one is actually talking about a regular chevel, which would actually be forbidden midrabanan. We're going to see in a minute that the rabbis are going to explain that this chevel that we're allowing is not any regular rope. Normal ropes actually are prohibited by rabbinic law, and that's what he's referring to in the last line. So anyway, the Gemara starts off and says, chevel damai, ilema chevel da'alma. Remember, ilema means if you think this, we're actually going to reject it. If you want to say a regular chevel, Rabbi Yehuda matir, kesher shel kayamahu. Well, how can Rabbi Yehuda matir? It's a kesher shel kayama. It's a kesher that's going to last. Ela chevel de garde. Okay, in other words, when you put a rope on a pail, like this usually you use to dip into your well to draw the water out, that's something that lasts for a long time. So why would it be allowed? Therefore, they say it must be chevel de gardi. It must be you're using a rope that was used by the weavers, which means that if you're using the rope, the weaving rope, that's not a rope. Generally, this is classic. It happens. You want something and you don't have exactly what you need, so you take something else and you say, oh, temporarily, I'm going to put this there. But obviously, when you need it for the weaving, you're going to undo it. L'meimer de Rabbanit Savrei gazrinan chevel de garde atu chevel de alma. Rabbi Yehuda savar lo gazlinan. So wait a minute. If it's talking about a chevel de gardi, nobody really thinks a chevel de gardi is kayama. So why, right, it's going to long lasting. So why would the rabbis, we were trying to explain Rabbi Yehuda why he allowed it. Now we have to explain the rabbis who forbid it. Why did they forbid doing this? If it's a chevel de gardi, theoretically, you're going to undo it. So the assumption is they must say, well, gozlim chevel de gardi atu chevel de alma. Since a regular rope is a problem, so we're not going to allow the weaver's rope, just so that you don't get confused and think you can use a regular rope. Rabbi Yehuda savar lo gazlina. Rabbi Yehuda holds, no, we don't make a gzera. There's no reason chevel de gardi is different. Everybody knows the difference. If you want to say that that's the case, remember we started with an ilema. If you want to say that that's the case, well, we have a problem. We started here with a lamema. Are you trying to say, and usually it's going to be a question, Ureminu contradicts the following source. Chevel delisha nifsak, lo yehe koshro ela onvo. If you have a rope attached to a pail and it tears, so you can't, the only way you could tie it is using a bow. Rabbi Yehuda omer korech ala punda upiskaya ubavad shelo ya'anvena. You can put these two parts together, the parts that ripped, by wrapping a belt around it or something like that, but you can't actually tie it. Okay, so he says tying them is not allowed. So now we have a big problem here, because in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda allowed the chevel of the weavers and the rabbis didn't. In this case, it's the opposite. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow you to do the tying in a bow, and the rabbis allow it. So kasha de Rabbi Yehuda, kasha de Rabbanan, right? Each one is machmir in a different case. And if you say it's a whole gzera issue, well, then there should be gozer here also on the aniva. So adrabanan lo kasha. Chevel b'chevel michlif, aniva b'kshira lo michlifa. Yes, we could see how someone might confuse a rope for a rope, but we're not going to have people confuse tying in a bow to tying a knot. Those are two very different things. And therefore, the rabbis don't see a reason to make a gzera in that case, but they do in the case of the two different ropes. To Rabbi Yehuda kshirahi. But Rabbi Yehuda, I skipped a line. To Rabbi Yehuda lo kashya. Hatam lo mishum demichlapa anifa b'kshira, ela anifa gufa kshirahi. It's not because we want to make a gzera and say, well, if we allow this, then you'll come to allow that. He actually views tying a bow as a form of a knot, because we talked before how tying a bow could be very solid. It's a very solid way of tying something. So he actually views it as kshira, and that's why he's machmir, not because of any gzera. So we can go back and explain our first case as the gzera as we wanted to earlier. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi, Amar Rav. Mevi adam chevel b'toch beto ukoshro b'para u'behevus. If you want, there's the feeding trough of the animals, and then there's the animal. So you can take a rope and you can tie it. Take a rope from your house, tie one part to the cow, one part to the feeding trough, the feeding area, and that's okay. We saw that we had yesterday or the day before that Rabbi Acha, the tall one, who's Rabbi Acha bar Papa, says to Rabbi Abba, you can tie these one to another, but notice what they said. If it's already tied to the feeding trough, then you can tie it to the para, to the cow. And likewise, if it's already tied to the para, then you could attach it to the feeding trough. But you can't take chevel and tie it on both ends. So how can we explain this? What do they answer? Hatam chevel de alma, hacha chevel de garde. Again, we're going to distinguish between a regular rope. If you have a regular rope, you can't tie it on both sides, because what's the assumption? The assumption is that you might actually end up leaving it tied on one end. And you'll just untie one end and leave the other side tied. But that's only in a case of a regular rope. However, if you were using weaver's ropes, then we're going to assume you're going to untie it on both sides, because when you need it for the weaving, you're going to untie it. Amal Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Klei kivai mutar letatalam b'Shabbat. Okay, now we're getting into muktzah, since we're talking about these objects. Now we're going to talk about the kelim that they use. There was a kind of, what do you call it? It's a type of hook or needle or a sharp tool that they would use to separate the strings, okay, the threads. Before they did the weaving, they would separate the threads with it. So those kind of utensils, mutar letatalam b'Shabbat. They're allowed to be carried on Shabbat. Why? Because even though it's a klisha malachto isur and it should be muktzah, you use it for forbidden purposes, but also it's used for all sorts of other purposes. In other words, it's not a special, unique utensil that's only used for that. What about the wooden round little logs that they would use, or wooden pieces that they would use in the loom to wrap the strings around. They would basically they would allow them to move the strings up and down. So in the weaving loom. So the kovet al yom kovet atachton mahu. What's the halacha? Are those muktzah? Are those used for other purposes, or really only if you have something that's called the klisha malachto leheter uli isur? It's used for both forbidden and permitted things. Then we allow you to use it on Shabbat. So what's the case with these? In vela v'rafi v'yade. Okay, that means sometimes he said yes, sometimes he said no, but really he didn't really know. Okay, wasn't so clear on what the answer is. Itmar, it was said, Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, Klei kivai mutar l'taltalam b'Shabbat, afilu kovet al yom v'kovet tachton, aval lo et amudim. Okay, so according to Rav Nachman, in the name of Shmuel, you're allowed to carry all of those things. What you're not allowed to carry are, apparently, and what I read up about in the Schottenstein, maybe there's different opinions, that there were these big wooden planks that were at the bottom of the weaving loom, and there were two of them, and I think they helped move things up and down, they were used as part of the loom, not in a professional one, but more in a handmade one. They would have these blocks, these big squares or rectangles that were on the ground, and it was part of the loom. These, because they're in the ground, you're not actually allowed to move them on Shabbat. So we're going to see why. Amar le Rav Nachman, Ma'ishna mudim delo. Why not? If it's because they're making holes in the ground, when you pick them up, you end up with this hole in the ground. But that's not true, because gumot mimena kahavian, the holes are already there. And how do we know that that's not a problem? All you're doing is removing the piece from the floor, and then there'll be a hole, but the hole was there from beforehand. How do we know that that's not a problem? They're going to quote a Mishna. If you put turnips or radishes and they're not planted, you just want to stick them in the ground to protect them. If you're going somewhere and you want to hide them in the ground, so you can put them under the geffen. Now here we're going to see why under the geffen, because we're going to see we're not worried about all sorts of halachic issues here. If some of the leaves are out from under the ground, we're not worried about kilaim, meaning you're putting it next to geffen and you can't plant seeds next to a geffen, but you're not planting, so there's no problem of mixing different breeds together. The lo mishum shvi'it, it's not an issue of in the Shemitah year, you're not actually planting. The lo mishum maaser, you're not chayav in maasrot, the tithing, because you didn't plant it. And here's our issue, v'nitalim b'Shabbat. Okay, they can be taken out on Shabbat. If you just pull up the leaf from the leaves, you can take it out of the ground, even though theoretically you're creating a hole. Basadeh, okay, v'nitalim b'Shabbat basadeh. Okay, why basadeh? Lo ate lashvuye gumot. Okay, but hacha babayit ate lashvuye gumot. But now they say, no, wait, there's a difference in the field. In the field, you're allowed to do this because you're not going to come to flatten out the ground. But in a house, you might come to flatten out the ground, and that's why in the house, it's a problem to pick up these amudim. So originally they thought this isn't a problem because the hole's already there, and you see with the radish or the turnip that it's not a problem to make a hole. But they say that's all in the fields, because in the fields, you're not going to start flattening out the ground. You don't really care if there's holes in the ground. But when it's in your house, if you end up with this hole, you're going to end up flattening the ground, and that's why it's forbidden to move them, because you might flatten the ground underneath. So therefore, again, we have the klei kivai, the implements they use to straighten out the threads, and the kovet tachton and kovet elyon, which were used for the weaving loom to go up and down, right, to attach the strings so that you can move them in different directions. As you're weaving, those are not muktzah, because you can use them for other things. However, these beams that are on the floor, or these pieces of wood that are on the floor, or pieces of whatever they are as part of the loom, those are forbidden because they'll make a hole in the ground and you might end up flattening the ground. So he says the klei kivai, the weaving implements like the kovet elyon, the kovet atachton, here you've used them as the same. So here he says, why not, right? Here he says, it's a different opinion. This says you can't carry them. Maitam, lefi she'ein nitalim. Okay, he basically answers, because they're not carried. Now this seems weird. What do you mean? You can't carry them because they're not carried? But Rashi explains, af bechol mipnei kovdan. Hilkach Kol melachtan lekach. These are intended for, they're very heavy and they're not generally moved, and therefore you're not allowed to move them on Shabbat because they wouldn't really be moved unless you need them. So again, according to this opinion, they're muktzah on Shabbat. New Mishnah. Now we're moving topics. Mekaplim et hakelim afilu arba'a v'chamisha pa'amim. You're allowed to fold your clothes even 4 or 5 times. We're going to see this number 4 or 5 comes up a lot in the Mishnayot. It's often they'll ask, why does it say if you could do it 5 times, and obviously you could do it 4 times in our Gemara. I didn't see that question asked, but in any case, they say you're allowed to fold them even 4 or 5 times. Umitzi'ina tamitot milelei Shabbat l'Shabbat. And you can make your bed from Friday night to Shabbat if you need your bed made for Shabbat. Aval, but the following things cannot be done lo mi-Shabbat le-Motzei Shabbat. It can't be done from Shabbat to Motzei Shabbat. If you don't need it done on Shabbat, the folding of the clothes, the idea of folding the clothes was to get out the wrinkles. So you can't do it if it's not for Shabbat itself. Rabbi Yishmael omer, mekaplim et hakelim u'mitziim et hamitot miyom kippurim l'Shabbat. You can do this on Yom Kippur for Shabbat. If Yom Kippur comes out Erev Shabbat, this never happens anymore, but it could have theoretically happened in their days. Rabbi Yishmael omer mekablim et hakelim u'mitziim et hamitot. Sorry, I just read that. Sorry. No. So now Rabbi Yishmael says a different opinion. Mikaplim. Did I just read that? 1 second. Sorry, I read that. V'chalbei Shabbat krevim b'yom kippurim, and the fats that are supposed to be burned on the altar in the sacrifices that you would generally do in the afternoon or the nighttime if it didn't get done during the day. So the chalef under Shabbat could be burned b'yom kippurim if it comes out on Motzei Shabbat. Here's the opposite case. Aval lo shel Yom Kippurim b'Shabbat, but you can't burn the fats from Yom Kippurim to Shabbat, or you can't make the beds in Yom Kippurim for Shabbat. Rabbi Akiva omer lo shel Shabbat krevim b'Yom Kippurim v'lo shel Yom Kippurim krevim b'Shabbat. You can't burn the fats of either day on the other day. It goes in both directions. Okay. Amrei debei Rabbi Yanai lo shanu ela ba'adam echad aval b'shnei b'nei adam lo. So now they say this is only one person. One person is not allowed to fold their clothes for the next day. But 2 people, but b'shnei b'nei adam, no, it's not forbidden. Uba'adam echad nami lo amaran ela b'chadashim. And even one person can't do it. It's only in new clothes. Aval b'yishanim lo. Okay, he's allowed. Sorry, 1 second. Let me just correct something. Sorry, quick correction. When we said Lo v'amru ela ba'adam echad, we're talking about the part in the Mishnah where you're allowed to do this. You can only fold clothes. This is interesting. I was confused for a minute because generally 2 people do an action and you're not obligated. But in this case, they want to say that 2 people folding a piece of clothing is going to be a much better job than 1 person. Think about a big tablecloth. If you want to fold it, the best way to do it is to have somebody else helping you. So if 2 people do it, then it's actually not allowed, even if you're doing it for that day, because that's already a much more professional job. So again, let's start again. Lo shanu ela ba'adam echad, aval b'shnei b'nei adam lo, 2 people can't. Uba'adam echad, when we want to say they can do it, lo amaran ela b'chadashim, only can fold new clothes. Aval b'yishanim, the assumption is they're much more wrinkled, and therefore lo. It fixes them more. They say chadashim kashime alehem ve'em ma'arim likmot. They say new clothes don't really get wrinkled, but the old clothes, by folding them, you're really doing a serious job on unwrinkling them. The chadashim nami lo amaran, and even the new ones that are allowed, lo amaran, we're basically limiting how much you can really fold on Shabbat. Lo amaran ela bilavanim, aval b'tzvuim lo. Apparently colored clothing were different, maybe texture, wrinkled more than others, and therefore you can't. The lo amaran ela she'en lo lachlif, aval yesh lo lachlif lo. And this is only, by the way, if you have nothing else to wear. But if you have something else to wear, then we don't allow it. Okay, what's the whole big problem with folding? I should have mentioned this when we were reading the Mishnah. What's the issue? So some people say that it's uvda dechol, in other words, or tircha yetera. You're doing extra work that you don't really need to be doing on Shabbat. Think about it. Folding laundry is not exactly the hardest job. On the other hand, it's an annoying chore, right? It is a chore, and it is something you have to do. And therefore, one can't just sit and fold laundry on Shabbat because you shouldn't push off. From here, we're going to get to all sorts of things that it's not appropriate to do on Shabbat, even if it's not exactly a malacha. Tana shel Beit Rabban Gamliel lo hayu makaplim klei lavan shelehem mipnei shaya lehen lahachlif. So in the house of Rabban Gamliel, if you remember, he was very wealthy, and therefore they didn't need, right? They had lots more clothes, and therefore they wouldn't do it on Shabbat. Makif la Rav Safra. Sorry, I skipped. Okay. Amar Rav Huna, im yesh lo lachlif yachlif. If he has other clothes, he should change into them and not fix the wrinkled ones. V'im ein lo lachlif yishalshel b'bigadav. In other words, if he doesn't have Shabbat clothes to wear, so what should he do? He should make his clothes longer. Here we're talking now about wearing nicer clothes on Shabbat and how you should wear different clothes on Shabbat. If you don't have, you should at least pull it down. Okay, and now we're going to say why pull it down? Because it was wealthy people who walked with very long clothing. Why is that? Poor people needed shorter clothing so it didn't get in the way of their work. Richer people who weren't doing hard menial labor, they didn't have to worry about their clothes dragging on the floor. If you think about maxi skirts, okay, so I mean, it's not exactly that only rich people wear them, but I always concerned with maxi skirts, they're dragging on the floor, someone's going to trip over them. Imagine trying to work, do hard labor in them, right? It wouldn't make sense. And they wore these long robes in those days. You can also think about fancy dresses. You go to a wedding, right? Wedding gown is always to the floor. To the floor is something that was seen as something much fancier. But if you're a poor person, he says, and you pull down your cloak to the floor, you somehow make it very long. And then often they claim that they were long, but they would wear them shorter while they were doing their work. So on Shabbat, you should let it out. But it looks like you're being arrogant. You're saying, hey, look, I'm walking around like a wealthy person. But the answer, because you don't do this every day and you're only doing it now, it doesn't look like you're being arrogant. So now we're going to start darshaning this pasuk, okay, and this has to do with the clothing on Shabbat. You should respect Shabbat me'asot drachecha. Okay, this is a famous pasuk. Okay, we're going to see. It's in Yeshayahu. It's famous pasuk for Shabbat. Im tashiv mi Shabbat raglecha asot chafetzecha b'yom kodshi v'karata l'Shabbat oneg l'kadosh Hashem mechubad b'chida badeto me'asot drachecha mimtzo chafetzecha v'daber davar. Okay, if you, trying to translate it exactly, if you return mi Shabbat raglecha, in other words, you do something different with your feet on Shabbat, asot chafetzecha, change, and that you should shift gears and don't do the same raglayim. Your feet shouldn't move in the same way. You shouldn't do your general chafetzecha, your things that you're doing during the week. Right, b'yom kodshi, it should be different. You should call Shabbat oneg, so we call oneg Shabbat, enjoying Shabbat. L'kadosh Hashem mechubad, it's for God that it's respectful. V'kibadito me'asot drachecha, you should respect it from doing things, okay, we'll see, from your general ways. Mimtzo chapatzecha, from doing your general chapatzim, your objects. Vidaber davar, and speech-wise. We're going to talk about what all this means very soon. Kibadito me'asot drachecha. So what does this mean? The kibadito shelo yeh mabushcha b'shal Shabbat k'mabushcha shechol. You should have Shabbat clothes. That's what we call them, Shabbat clothes. They should be different. Chihad Rabbi Yochanan kari lamani machbedoti. Okay, and we see that Rabbi Yochanan called his clothes my items of respect. And as he used the root kabed for the term for his clothing. Okay, the clothes make the man, right? Or all sorts of things about clothing, how important it is for how you look. You should walk in a different way. Okay, what does that mean, right? Some people say you shouldn't be running. You should walk in a different manner. Okay, you're allowed to do things for the purposes of Shabbat, of a mitzvah, but not for your own, because it says chafatzecha. So here Rashi says, like for example, poskim tzedakah, you could say I'm going to give a certain amount of tzedakah because that's for a mitzvah, or mishtadchim ala tinokot le'ares. You can make a shidduch if you want. Okay, here they actually say tinokot for young children, but even older, right? You can make a shidduch, make an arranged marriage on Shabbat, even though theoretically it's like doing kind of like a business transaction, but because it's for a mitzvah, it's allowed. However, if it's for your own purposes, it's not allowed. You should speak differently. Okay, there's a big debate. What does it mean? You should speak in a different way. So some people say you should speak, this is actually a really interesting one. I'll quote the strangest one first, that you should only speak in Hebrew on Shabbat. Okay, there's some people who think that that's the case. Other people say you shouldn't speak as much, and even Divrei Torah, you should try to minimize your speech on Shabbat. And some people say what it really means, and this is the general, that you shouldn't speak about mundane things, about things that have to do with during the week. You shouldn't speak about your business, your work. Now, again, it's all in proportion, right? Sometimes that's the time you have to talk about things, and if it's in a way that's going to stress you out, then you probably shouldn't talk about it. If it's a way that's not going to stress you out, then you can talk about it. right? I can remember myself during times in my life where people ask me things on Shabbat about how things are going. And if I was particularly stressed about it, I said, you know what, I prefer not to talk about this on Shabbat. Okay, next. Dibur asur chilhor mutar. What do you learn from this, though? That speaking is forbidden, but thoughts, you can have thoughts. You can think about your business. You can think about how often I wake up all the time, Shabbat morning. And because I'm not, well, you all know I teach Daf Yomi first thing in the morning. So usually Shabbat's my one day I don't teach it in the morning. So usually I wake up in the morning and I right away go to prepare the daf, finish preparing, start teaching. But on Shabbat, when I wake up, I don't have that. And I often wake up with all these thoughts of all these things that I didn't take care of during the week. And of course, there's nothing you can do about them on Shabbat. So that's actually allowed, even though I really shouldn't be talking about those things, but I can think about them. Why is thinking allowed? So some people say, well, you can't really control your thoughts. And that's a really good question. Can you control your thoughts? Can't you? So go think about that. The second option is to say that it's actually, if you start talking about divrei chol, you're actually, I'm thinking of the English word, but you're pogea b'kvod Shabbat. You're kind of breaking the kedusha of Shabbat, the sanctity of it. But if you're just thinking it, that doesn't really do very much. And this, by the way, goes back to an age-old question, which comes up all over the Gemara about is how much your thoughts considered like speaking. And in some areas of halacha, thoughts are very significant. In other areas, thoughts are really not significant. I'll just give you one brief one. In laws of damages, it doesn't really matter what you were thinking. If you damage, you damage. We don't care what your thoughts were. If you meant to do something really nice to someone, in the end you damage them, well, you're responsible. On the other hand, when it comes to the Beit HaMikdash, your thoughts can actually mess things up. Your thoughts are critical. And there's a whole debate, like let's say pigul, where you have a thought, I'm going to eat it in the wrong time, in a time that I'm not allowed to eat it. That messes up the korban. So some people say there it means if you said you're going to eat it, and it's not just thinking it, it's that you actually have to say it. But some people say, no, it really means your thoughts themselves. So it's always a debate about how important thoughts are, and it sometimes depends on the context. So in this context, your thoughts are not a problem. By the way, this whole thing sounds like some of the zmirot that we sing, especially Ma Yedidu Menuchatech, where we talk about Hirurim Asurim, Hirurim Mutarim Uleshadech Habanot, all the things that you can do on Shabbat or things that you can't do. Right? Chafatzecha Asurim Begam Lachashev Cheshbonot, Hirurim Mutarim Uleshadech Habanot. Okay, so there you have the things that we just talked about. Bishlama Kulu Lechaye. Ela Shelo Yehu Lechacha B'Shabbat Ki Lechacha Shel Chol. So now they say, we understand all these things. One second. L'chaye, right? Everything here makes sense. But which one don't we understand? What about, so we just explained all the parts of the pasuk. But what happened? We explained. Shelo yehei luchacha shel Shabbat ki luchacha shel chol maihi. What is that line? So what does it mean to walk differently? Ki hada amar Rav Huna amar Rav amar la'amar Ravi Abba amar Rav Huna hayam alech b'Shabbat upaga ba'amat hamayim. If you get to a place where there's a big puddle or a stream or something, there's a water running through, and if you can keep one foot on the ground and put your other foot across, right? If you can always have one foot on the ground, then that's okay, being lav. But if you have to jump over it, asur. That's what we mean you can't walk. You can't start jumping, right? Things like that are harder to do, not allowed to do on Shabbat. Matkifla Rava questions and says, hey, so what are you supposed to do? If you want to say walk around, you're making someone walk even more than they need to. That seems like more work. What about going over it? Let's say, why don't you just walk through the water? But what could happen? We just talked about schita the other day, squeezing out. If you walk through the water, your clothes might get wet, and then you'll end up squeezing them out, which is forbidden. So So if you're stuck, there's no choice, then you do. But generally, you're not allowed to jump. So wait. So now they say, my mistake. So they say it can't be jumping over this thing is a problem because if you have no other way to do it, that's the best way to do it, and therefore jumping is allowed. So what could it mean? Taking the wrong step, walking differently? So Rabbi asked Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, Shabbat. Can you take big steps, okay, or walk fast on Shabbat? What do you mean? That's not even allowed on a regular day. It blinds you by 1/500th. In other words, it takes away a little bit of your vision every time you do that. because it's an arrogant way to walk. And that arrogance that you lose by walking in an arrogant manner, but the kiddush that you make ben hashmasha when you bring in Shabbat, that brings it back. Okay, so what is this basically saying? So now you have to kind of zoom out. There was this discussion about Siagasa. He asked, can you do it on Shabbat? And he said, of course you can't do it on Shabbat. You can't even do it on a weekday. But what he's really saying is, because people do walk fast on a weekday, they're always busy with what they're doing, and we rush and we move around. And in fact, it seems in those days they did also. He says on a weekday, it's not a good thing, and it's arrogance, and it takes away your part of your vision, which you can get back if you take Kiddush seriously and you make Kiddush on Friday night. But on Shabbat, it seems like he's implying it's actually forbidden, and that's the walking that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Okay, some people say that maybe the difference is that on Shabbat, you don't get it. If you do it on Shabbat, then you don't get it back in Kiddush on Ben Hashmasha, okay, and only during the week. But if you do it on Shabbat, it's much worse. Another question. He asked him, can you eat dirt from the ground on Shabbat? Okay, now this, by the way, we're switching topics. It's just another question that Rebbe asked Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, and it has to do with for medicinal purposes. We're back to that. So, is this even allowed on a regular day? It's actually not good for you. So you're not allowed to do this any day of the week. Now we're going to see why this was such a bad thing to do. Rabbi Ami says if you eat from the afar of Bavel specifically, from the ground, and in Bavel, what's the problem? It's like you're eating from the bone, from the flesh of your fathers, because we have all these dead bodies buried here all over the place. Why? Now think about it. Our forefathers lived in Israel. Why in Bavel? Okay, in the Mabul, in the flood, everything was wiped out. Why is Bavel also called Shin'ar? Because all the people from the flood were thrown into Bavel. So therefore, buried in the depths of Bavel are all these dead bodies from the Mabul. And therefore, if you eat from the ground, you're eating dead bodies. It was also called Mitzula. Why? Because they all got drowned in Bavel. Some people say, okay, it's like you're eating shkatzim u'remasim, okay, creepy crawlers. So now they say, well, if you're eating creepy crawlers, and the assumption is there's lots of shkatzim u'remasim around Bavel, and therefore you can't eat from the ground because you're basically eating shkatzim u'remasim, which are forbidden. So then they say, but havadai, it machuye, it mache, but they all get absorbed and they're dissolved and they're not actual anymore. So why should it be a problem? Amar, kevan demalke gazru be Rabbanan. So now the answer, right? Kevan demalke, 1 second, malke is, where's Rashi? Kevan demalke, because, right. They say because it's malkeh, because it makes you sick, it's not good for you. Like we said before, the rabbis forbade it, meaning, and they said it's like eating shkatzim u'remasim. It's not like you're really eating them, but it's like eating them. Tahu gavra, there was a person, now we're going to see a story. Ta'achal gergishta, he ate some dirt. Ba'achal tachle, and he ate some cress after. V'kad chulei tachle b'libe u'meit. And the whole thing what happened was, this is very interesting. I always thought about this when I used to eat watermelon seeds when I was a kid, that maybe a watermelon is going to grow inside me. Well, the problem is if you eat dirt and then you eat it, this cress, then the cress took root in his body in the soil that he ate, and he died. Okay, so I said dirt, but what I really mean is soil here, right? Soil from the earth, and he died. Okay, there's a note in the Koren, the Steinsaltz, which basically says that there is a phenomenon of something like this happening, where not exactly that things grow, but that people get soil stuck in, and it will causes blockages in people's intestines. So this could theoretically actually happen, or could really actually happen. Okay, now we're going to get to V'rachatz v'sach v'samsim lotayach. We're now quoting a pasuk from Ruth. And why are we quoting this? Because we're talking about the clothing. When we talked about how important clothing on Shabbat is, we're now back to our topic. So it says by Ruth, so she washed, she anointed herself, and then she put on her simla. Amar Rabbi Elazar, elu b'gadim shel Shabbat. What's simla? That's Shabbat clothes. Ten l'chakam od. Okay, to give to a wise person, he'll even do even farther, right? You tell someone to do something and they're smart. They sometimes take it one step farther. Amar Rabbi Elazar, zo Ruth hamovia Shmuel Ramati. Okay, how so? Ruth, di'ilu na'ama ka'amar la v'rachatz v'sach v'samsim lotayich alayich. V'yarad tagoren. Put them on, right? Do all that, and then go to the goren where you're going to see Boaz. V'ilu b'didakti, but when she actually does it, it says it in a different order. Starts off bateret a goren. First, she went to the goren. V'hadar v'taz kochel asher tzivta chamotan. Then she does everything that Naomi told her to do. Why is that? Because it was more tsanua, and if she walked all fancy, decked out, and dressed up, she was going to attract a lot of attention, and people would think maybe she was engaging in prostitution, and therefore Ruth was smarter, right? She took, but Naomi said one step farther. Ushmuel, what did he do? Di'ilu Eli ka'amarle, when Eli told him, Shchav hayam yikai lecha va'amarta davar Hashem ki shomea avdecha. If you hear, remember Shmuel goes to Eli, and if you know this from the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, he's a na'ar, he's a young child working in the Mikdash and in the Mishkan, and he hears these voices, and then Eli finally realizes it must be God, so he says, if he calls you, you should say, God, speak because I can hear you. I'm listening. But when Shmuel actually speaks, it says, so God came again and he called out, Shmuel, Shmuel, daber ki shomea avdecha. He didn't want to be so presumptuous that he knew it was God. Maybe it was an angel. Maybe it was something else. So he didn't say that. Continuing on in Drashot with Ruth. It says she went back and forth. She went very carefully picking and choosing who she was going to be with. Here's a great question. Right? This is something you would see typical. A guy sees a girl and says, oh, who's that girl? But it doesn't seem appropriate for Boaz to do that kind of thing. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, he saw intelligence in her. It wasn't he said, oh, she's so gorgeous. But he realized she had Dvar Chochma. Rashi even said Dvar Halacha. I think it was Rashi that, right, he saw that she was keeping halacha. Okay, we're going to see right now what's the halacha. Because Shnei Shibolim Lakta, Shlosha Shibolim Eina Lakta. She only took when she saw two bundles together, but not three, because that's the halacha, that you're not, when you leave it for the poor people, it's only if you leave three behind. If you leave two behind or less, but if you leave three behind, then you can already come back and collect it. You don't have to leave it for the poor people. B'manitatan, and a bright it says, Dvar tzniut rabba. It wasn't that he saw her keeping halacha and he was so impressed, but he saw her acting in a tzanua fashion, with modesty. Omdot mu'umad noflot miyushav. The ones that were standing, she would collect while she was standing, and the ones that were on the ground, she would sit down. She wouldn't bend down. She wasn't so modest. She would crouch down, and that's how she would take. Then he says to her, listen, and you should stick with my na'arot. Now, it's a bit of a strange question. The Mefarshim have struggled with it, but I'll explain it as best as I can. He's telling her lidabekim anashim, but I think the fact that he uses the lashon of lidabek, which is often used in a male-female manner in the Torah, and in a somewhat sexual manner. So why is he mentioning these words? So Amar Rabbi Elazar, kevan dechazav atishak or palachamuta berutav kaba, Amar shari lidabukeba, because, and they were making a reference to the fact that Ruth Davka, she clung to Naomi, so he uses that same root and is basically saying he saw the goodness in her and he saw that she was potential for him, and that's why he uses that language. Vayomer labos leita ochel geshi halom. Okay, should come halom. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, remez chamazla atida machu beit David latzim mimech tichtiv beit halom. Okay, it was a remez to this pasuk about David, about the Beit Halom. Shneimar vayavam elch David vayishev l'pnei Hashem vayomer mi anochi Adoni Hashem u'mi beiti ki v'yatani ad halom. So that was mentioned in reference to David, and therefore it's a reference to the fact that David is going to come from her. V'tavat pitech b'chometz, and you should dip your bread into vinegar. It sounds familiar. We've been talking about this. Amar Rabbi Elazar mikan she'chometz yafeh l'sharab. He told her dip your bread in vinegar because it was very hot out. Remember, it was the hot season, and therefore, right, it was the Ksir Chitim Shavuot time. Therefore, from here you learn it's good to eat, dip it in vinegar. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar, Remez Ramazla, Atid latzet mimech ben shemasav kashim kechometz. So here we have a different drasha. A son is going to come from you whose maasim, whose actions are bad like vinegar. Umanu, and who is this? Menashe. This is Menashe, one of the future kings who's soon before the destruction. He was a very bad king, and it was a reference to him. Vatesha mitzad kotzlim. So there were two explanations of the chometz. Now she sits next to the kotzlim, mitzad kotzlim. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, mitzad kotzlim v'lo b'tocha kotzlim. Again, we're going to see, we're basically suggesting, at least a lot of these, that there's some future. These are all references to things that are going to happen in the future. So why is she b'tzad kotzlim and not among the kotzlim? This is a reference to the fact that the kingdom of David is going to be split eventually into Rechavam and Yeravam, the son of Shlomo. Right in his time, the Malchut splits into Yisrael and Yehuda. Vayitzbat la koli v'techal. Amar Rabbi Elazar v'tochal b'yimei David. Okay, now you have to read the rest of this pasuk to understand. It says, so we gave her this roasted grains. And then it says, right, this is the whole pasuk. Boaz says to her, Le'eta ochel boshi halom v'achalt min alechem. You'll eat from the bread, v'tapal p'tei b'chometz, and you'll dip it in vinegar. It's kind of like he's predicting what's going to happen right now, but it's really predicting what's going to happen in the future. That's how they're darshaning it. And then she sits misada kotzlim, right? And then vayitzbat lakali v'tochal v'tisba v'total. She eats, she's satiated, and she has extra. So now they're going to have a reference to 3 different things, and there'll be a few different drashot on this. V'tochal b'yimei David, v'tisba b'yimei Shlomo, v'totar b'yimei Chizkiah. They're talking about years that there will be plenty. In the time of David, in the time of Shlomo, in the time of Chizkiah, there was a lot of wealth. V'kadam rei v'tochal b'yimei David u'b'yimei Shlomo. V'tochal is, okay, the first stage is David and Shlomo. That's considered one time period. V'tisba b'yimei Chizkiah, that's the second time period. V'totar b'yimei Rebbe. Now we're jumping to our time period, in other words, the time of the Mishna. So in the days of Rebbe, because Rebbe, if you remember, Rebbe is a descendant of the Malchut David. He comes from the Davidic dynasty. Ta'amar mar, ahorire de Rebbe haya atir mishavor malka. Okay, the ahoriria, I forgot what that is. Rashi says, the mimuneh al susim upradot shelo. The person who was in charge of his susim and his pradot, and his mules, his horses and his mules, was richer than Shavor Malka, who was the Persian king, who was obviously very wealthy. Third option, forget about David and Shlomo. No, all of this world, then there's the Yemot HaMashiach, and then vatotar la'atid lavo. Okay, that's in the future. Okay, so we have different references here, and this all we got this was we were talking about the importance of clothing on Shabbat, having different clothing, and then they learned from Ruth that she was wearing, when she went to Boaz, she put on her Shabbat clothes, and there you see a reference to, there's different kind of clothes, and these were Shabbat clothes she was wearing. From there we got into all sorts of drashot about what made Ruth unique, what did Boaz see in her, how did Boaz, why was he speaking the way he was speaking to her in all sorts of ways, and what was he alluding to about her future and things that were going to happen in the future in this verse that we saw about what he recommends for her to do. Okay, we're going to stop here and we'll pick up from more issues about clothing in the next shiur.